It began with silence. The train had stopped hours ago, but the women still sat inside, too afraid to move. The Kansas air outside was heavy with dust and heat, nothing like the Europe they had left behind. A guard opened the doors and shouted, "Rouse." His voice wasn't angry, just tired. They stepped out one by one, thin, pale, wrapped in gray coats that no longer fit. Most of them were nurses, clerks, or medics from the Luftwaffe. They had crossed an ocean in the dark, believing they were being sent to punishment, or worse. What they found instead was a place that looked ordinary. Camp Concordia, Kansas. Rows of wooden barracks, white fences, small flags snapping in the wind. There were even flowers, petunias planted along the walkway by some American hand. The women looked around in disbelief. "A trap," someone whispered. "It has to be." When the American officer in charge approached, they stiffened like statues. He spoke slowly, his accent strange and flat. "You'll be housed here. Hot water's available. Dinner at 6. A few women laughed nervously, the kind of laugh that comes when fear can't find words. They thought they had misheard. Hot water. Dinner. That evening, they were taken to their quarters, barracks built of pine, with narrow beds, blankets folded with impossible precision, and a row of small rooms at the end. Inside, to their shock, hung mirrors. Clean, square mirrors, gleaming in the lamplight. For a long time, no one dared look. The first to do so was Greta Schultz, a nurse from Bremen. She had not seen her own reflection in months. She leaned forward, eyes wide, as if staring at a stranger. Her cheeks were hollow, her hair limp beneath her cap. Behind her, other faces appeared, gaunt, wary, ghost-like. "When they gave us mirrors," she later wrote, "we didn't recognize the women staring back. Someone whispered, 'This is cruelty. They want us to remember what we've lost.' But the mirrors stayed. And so did the confusion. The Americans were distant but polite. They issued blankets, soap, brushes, even small combs. They didn't shout. They didn't strike. One of the guards, a young man from Missouri, smiled awkwardly as he passed out towels. "You can wash up, ladies. Dinner's in an hour." That single word, "ladies," hit harder than any insult could have. It was the first time in years anyone had called them that. After washing, some untied their hair, long and matted from months under caps. They brushed it out slowly, hands trembling. Others simply sat by the mirrors, staring in silence. For the first time since the war began, they were not soldiers. They were women again, and they didn't know how to feel about it. In the mess hall that night, the smell of warm food drifted through the air, potatoes, bread, coffee. They ate without speaking. Outside, the guards smoked under the floodlights, their rifles hanging loosely at their sides. No one barked orders. No one watched them eat. Later, as the lights dimmed, whispers filled the barracks. "Why are they treating us like this? Maybe they want to make us weak. Maybe they pity us." In the corner, Greta wrote a line in her small notebook, the one she had hidden in her medical kit since North Africa. "They are not what I was told they would be. And that frightens me more than hate ever did." The next morning, the air smelled of soap and sawdust. The guards opened the doors to let in the sun. One of the women, Anna Fisher, stood at the threshold, watching the light spread across the camp. It was warm, almost kind. And yet, something inside her twisted, a sense of guilt for feeling relief. They had been ready for cages. Instead, they were given beds. They had been ready for punishment. Instead, they were offered dignity. At midday, an American nurse, young, with red hair tucked beneath a cap, came to check on them. She spoke a few words of German, awkward but genuine. "Alles gut? Do you need anything?" No one answered. But when she left, she placed something on the nearest table, a small wooden box filled with sewing supplies, needles, thread, and a pair of metal scissors. The women stared at it as if it were dangerous. Scissors meant choice. Scissors meant control. That night, as the others slept, Anna sat by the lamp, holding them in her hands. She felt the cool metal, heavy and strange. Outside, a train whistle echoed across the plains, the sound of a world moving on without them. She looked at her reflection one more time and whispered. If they want to kill us, why let us look like this? The question hung in the air, unanswered. In the morning, when the guards came by, they found the women standing in front of the mirrors again. Their hair was unbound, their uniforms neat, their eyes clearer than before. Something in the room had shifted, a fragile calm, mixed with quiet defiance. And then one voice broke the silence. May we cut it? Someone asked, gesturing to her hair. The guard blinked, unsure what to say. Finally, he shrugged. It's your hair. He walked away, leaving them in that soft, suspended moment, the kind that feels like the start of something no one quite understands. Outside, the wind carried the faint smell of breakfast. Inside, the women held the scissors like a secret they weren't ready to share. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. The sound of scissors was louder than the guard's boots. It started quietly, one snip, then another. In the dim light of the barack, hair fell to the floor like pieces of a broken past. The air smelled of soap and metal. Anna Fisher held the scissors with both hands, her fingers trembling. Across from her stood Greta Schultz, her eyes fixed on the reflection in the small mirror nailed to the wall. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Every cut was its own kind of confession. For years, their hair had been hidden under gray caps, part of the uniform, part of obedience. In the Reich, appearance wasn't personal. It was prescribed. You didn't choose your length, your style, your color. You belonged to the state, even in the way you looked. But now, in this small wooden room in Kansas, with a cracked mirror and borrowed scissors, choice returned, and it terrified them. One by one, others joined. They lined up by the wall, watching the strands gather on the floorboards. Some cut it short, almost to the scalp. Others just trimmed the ends, careful, cautious. The silence was strange, heavy, almost holy. An American nurse, the same red-haired woman from the day before, stood by the doorway. She didn't say much. Only nodded once and whispered, "Go ahead." And so they did. When the last piece fell, Anna looked down at the pile, blonde, brown, black, gray, a small mountain of identity they'd carried across an ocean. She knelt and gathered the strands into her hands, then stopped. There was no point keeping them. We were shedding the war, she wrote later. But we didn't know what we were becoming. Someone began laughing, soft, nervous, like a hiccup. Then another joined in. Soon half the room was laughing and crying at once. Not from joy, not even from sadness, but from the sheer absurdity of being human again. When the noise grew too loud, the guards outside peeked through the windows. One of them muttered, "Jesus, they're just cutting hair." The other replied, "Yeah, but listen, sounds like church in there." By evening, the barack was filled with mirrors catching the golden light of sunset. The women looked at one another and didn't recognize the faces anymore. Without their identical braids, they looked less like soldiers, and more like strangers. That night, the camp was unusually quiet. Even the guards noticed. The air had changed. Something invisible had shifted. Before lights out, Anna approached the American nurse who brought the scissors. "Why did you let us?" she asked in broken English. The woman smiled gently, though her eyes looked tired. "Because it's your hair," she said again. "It's not ours to control." Anna didn't answer. But when she returned to her bunk, she felt the weight of those words settle over her like a blanket. "It's yours." No one had said that to her since she was 19. Later that night, she woke to find Greta sitting up, combing her newly cut hair in the dark. Outside, the wind moved through the barracks like a distant ocean. Greta whispered without turning around, "Do you think this is mercy or a test?" Anna didn't know. Maybe both. The next morning, the camp looked almost cheerful. The women gathered outside for inspection, sunlight bouncing off short curls and cropped bangs. A few of the guards smiled without meaning to. It wasn't beauty they saw, it was life returning in slow motion. That afternoon, the red-haired nurse returned again, carrying a cardboard box tied with a red ribbon. The label on the side read, "Donations, Ladies' Aid Society." She set it on the table and stepped back. The women gathered around cautiously. One untied the ribbon. Inside were small parcels wrapped in brown paper. When they opened them, the room fell silent again. There, nestled in tissue paper, were lipsticks, bright red, American-made, with tiny silver tubes that gleamed in the sun. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Greta whispered, almost in disbelief, "Lipstick?" The nurse nodded. "It's from the women in town," she said. "They thought you might like something normal." Normal. The word felt foreign on their tongues. The women stared at the box, as if it contained something radioactive. Makeup had been forbidden during the war, dismissed as vanity, decadence, weakness. But now it sat there, glowing like contraband from another world. Anna reached out first. She lifted one tube, twisted it open, and stared at the color, deep crimson, the shade of courage or defiance, she couldn't tell which. The others watched her hand shake. She looked into the mirror, hesitated, then pressed it to her lips. The red bloomed against her pale skin, shocking, almost violent. Around her, the room went still. Someone gasped. Another woman began to clap. A few started laughing again, this time louder, freer. Outside, one of the guards looked through the window, saw the flash of red, and muttered, "Well, I'll be damned." Anna turned to Greta and smiled, the first real smile since capture. "It feels like rebellion," she whispered. Greta nodded. "No," she said softly. "It feels like forgiveness." That evening, when the sun sank behind the Kansas fields, the women of Camp Concordia gathered outside. Some still wore their gray uniforms, others plain shirts or donated dresses. But every single one of them, every nurse, every clerk, every prisoner, wore the same red mark on their lips. For the first time since the war began, they looked like themselves, and that frightened them almost as much as the war ever had. And far away, beyond the fences, an American journalist was on his way, a camera slung over his shoulder, chasing a story that would make headlines. They never heard the shutter click. It was a hot August afternoon, the kind that made the Kansas air shimmer like glass. The women stood outside the barracks, laughing, real laughter, the kind that startled even them. Someone had brought a gramophone from the guardhouse, and for once, music drifted through the camp. That's when the journalist arrived. He came in a jeep with a driver and a camera the size of a suitcase. The guards greeted him casually, they had been told a newspaper wanted a human story. He was from the Topeka Courier, a small publication, but the moment he saw the women, he knew what he had found. He lifted the camera and began shooting. No one stopped him. Through the lens, he saw what no one in America had seen before, German prisoners, all women, wearing red lipstick. Some were smiling shyly. Others stood stiffly, unsure whether to pose or look away. Behind them, the white fences gleamed, and the stars and stripes fluttered in the wind. One of the guards joked, "You're gonna make them famous." The photographer laughed. Maybe for the wrong reasons. That night, the flashbulbs still echoed in their dreams. When the paper came out a week later, the photo filled half the front page. The caption read, "Captured Angels, German women prisoners find peace in Kansas." It spread faster than anyone expected. The story was reprinted in Chicago, New York, even London. Readers couldn't believe it. Letters poured in, some praising America's mercy, others furious that the enemy was being treated like guests. At Camp Concordia, no one knew what to think. The guards said little, but they began to act differently, less distant, almost protective. A few brought extra bread or coffee to the women during morning rounds. But outside the fence, the world began to ask questions. A senator in Washington demanded an inquiry: are we spending taxpayers' money on lipstick for Nazis? A radio host in St. Louis called it the beauty scandal. Yet for every angry voice, there was another saying, if this is how we win, maybe it's worth it. Inside the camp, the women didn't read the papers. But they felt the tension in the air. The guards spoke in shorter sentences. The nurse stopped smiling as much. The next shipment of comfort aid never arrived. One morning, Anna noticed the box of lipsticks was gone. When she asked the nurse, the woman only said, orders from above. Then she added quietly, you should keep what you already have. Anna nodded. That night, she hid her lipstick under her pillow, as if it were contraband. Greta found her doing it and whispered, do you think they'll take that from us too? Anna shook her head. They can't. It's already inside us now. Days turned into weeks. The laughter faded, but something deeper remained, a strange, fragile dignity. When the guards called them out for roll, the women still wore the same red marks on their lips. Not for beauty. For memory. In late September, a new officer arrived to inspect the camp. He was young, polite, and curious. After touring the grounds, he paused by the women's barracks and asked the commandant, do they still wear the lipstick? Yes, the commandant said. Every day. The officer smiled faintly. Keep it that way, he said. It makes them look human. After he left, the commandant passed the order down quietly, no more talk about lipstick. No more photographs. No more questions. But by then, the photo had already done its work. Across America, women tore the picture from newspapers and pinned it to mirrors. If even they can look that way, one columnist wrote, so can we. The Victory Red lipstick, the same shade the prisoners wore, sold out in a month. Revlon ran ads calling it the color of freedom. The irony was unbearable. Inside the camp, Greta sat by the window, watching the sun sink over the plains. The light hit the barbed wire just right, turning it gold for a second before dusk swallowed it. They think we're free, she said softly. Because we smile. Anna didn't answer. She was looking at her reflection in the small mirror, the same mirror from the day they arrived. Her face was thinner now, her eyes clearer. She ran a finger across her lips, where the color had faded but not vanished. Maybe freedom isn't what they think it is, she murmured. Outside, the loudspeaker crackled to life, attention. All prisoners prepare for inspection. The women lined up, the wind tugging at their clothes. The guards counted heads, then saluted. Routine, discipline, order, the same rhythm as always. But when the sun fell completely, and the guards retreated, the women gathered again inside the barracks. Anna pulled a small candle from under her cot, lit it, and placed it on the table. She looked around at the faces glowing in the light, tired, scarred, but alive. Tomorrow, she said quietly, we start sewing again. It wasn't defiance. It was continuation, a rhythm of hands, of breath, of survival. The same rhythm that had carried them across the sea, through surrender, through shame, into this strange, quiet place where humanity had been returned to them, piece by fragile piece. And outside, the prairie wind carried the faint echo of laughter, like a memory refusing to die. When the photo hit the newspapers, America didn't know whether to smile, or to rage. It appeared on August 18, 1945, in the Topeka Daily Capital. A half-page spread, just below the headlines about Japan's surrender. The picture showed 5 German women standing outside a barrack, smiling faintly at the camera. Their hair was cropped short, their clothes clean, their lips painted red. The caption read, "Former enemies, now ladies again." By noon, copies of the paper were already pinned to shop windows across Kansas. By nightfall, the image had spread to St. Louis, Chicago, New York. Radio announcers mentioned it between bulletins about peace treaties. "Captured angels," one commentator said. "The war is truly over." But not everyone was ready to hear that. At the Camp Concordia command post, the telegraph machine began to rattle. Letters, telegrams, and angry notes arrived faster than anyone could read them. One, from an Iowa mother, said, "My son died over France. Why do our enemies wear lipstick while our boys lie in Europe?" Another came from California. "We didn't send our sons to die so Nazis could have mirrors and smiles." The officers tried to stay calm. Major Collins, the camp commander, spread the clippings across his desk. "We treated them decently," he told his adjutant. "Now we're paying for it." Outside, the Kansas wind carried the smell of dust and hay through the fences. The women didn't know about the uproar yet. Life in the camp moved with its usual rhythm: breakfast at dawn, inspection at 9, sewing after lunch. Only when an American guard brought in a stack of newspapers did they understand. Greta was the first to see it. She stared at the photo for a long time, tracing the outline of her face with her finger. Her hair looked lighter, her smile smaller than she remembered. She whispered, almost to herself, "They will hate us more for smiling than for fighting." Anna stood beside her, silent. She didn't need to read the English words, the meaning was written in every stare. That night, the guards grew quieter. Some avoided eye contact. Others looked at the women with something like guilt. One young corporal muttered, "You'd think they'd shot the president." But beyond the anger, other voices began to rise. Letters of a different kind arrived, from teachers, church groups, even widows. "Maybe this is what peace should look like," one woman from Ohio wrote. "We can't heal by hating forever." In Washington, the War Department held an emergency meeting. The headline had turned into what one memo called a public relations risk: German POW morale photos. The debate grew sharp. Some argued it was proof of American decency, others feared it made victory look soft. A colonel in charge of POW operations summed it up. "We wanted to show humanity. We forgot how much people still needed their hate." Inside the camp, the consequences arrived quietly. No more journalists were allowed past the gates. The nurse who had handed out the lipstick was reassigned. The remaining supplies, combs, makeup, ribbons, disappeared overnight. When Anna asked a guard what happened, he just shrugged. "Orders," he said. "From someone who doesn't like smiling prisoners." The women returned to their routines, though the atmosphere felt heavier now. The scissors still clicked, the sewing machine still hummed, but laughter had vanished. The mirrors on the walls seemed to reflect something colder, not faces, but waiting. One evening, Greta gathered the women in the barack and read aloud from a translation of an American newspaper one of the guards had smuggled in. She spoke slowly, choosing each word like a surgeon making an incision. "Some say these women are proof of our mercy. Others say they are proof we've forgotten our dead. Perhaps both are true." She folded the paper, her hands trembling slightly. "They talk about us as if we're symbols," she said. "But we're just people trying to remember how to breathe." In the corner, Anna whispered, "Maybe that's what frightens them, that we can." Outside, a storm rolled in from the west. The sky turned green, thunder low and distant. The guards hurried to secure the gates, shouting over the wind. In the barracks, the women closed the shutters, but rain still blew in through the cracks, drenching the floor. The lightning flashed, bright enough to catch the reflection in the mirrors. For an instant, their faces shone white, then disappeared again in darkness. When morning came, the storm had passed. The air was clean, cool, and still. On the mess hall table lay a new order stamped in red. No photographs. No press access until further notice. Major Collins signed it without comment. He looked out the window toward the women's compound, where the flag was still wet and heavy from the rain. "All that fuss," he said quietly, over a bit of color and a smile. But the damage, or perhaps the revelation, had already been made. Across the country, Americans kept debating what the picture meant. For some, it was a sign of weakness, for others, of strength. For a few, it was something they couldn't even name, the uneasy feeling that maybe, just maybe, mercy was the bravest thing left to learn. And back in Camp Concordia, the women resumed their days as if nothing had happened. But in every mirror, they now saw not just themselves, but the world watching. And a week later, that world came knocking again. A convoy of 3 jeeps rolled through the gate, carrying a delegation of journalists. Among them was one woman, tall, composed, her notepad already open. Her name was Helen Rogers, from Harper's Weekly. And she wasn't there to expose them. She was there to understand. She wasn't there to expose them. She was there to understand. Helen Rogers stepped out of the jeep, the Kansas wind flattening her skirt against her legs. The guard saluted stiffly, uncertain what to do with a woman carrying a reporter's badge instead of a gun. Beyond the fence, the prisoners watched, motionless, silent. Helen had seen the war's quiet faces. In 1944, she'd worked with the Red Cross in Naples, washing the wounds of soldiers who couldn't remember where they were from. Now she was chasing a different kind of story, what happened after hatred ran out. Inside the women's barracks, the air smelled of soap and iron. 15 prisoners sat on wooden benches, their hands folded, their eyes wary. Helen introduced herself, her voice steady. "I'm not here to ask about the war," she said. "I want to ask about you." The translator hesitated, then repeated her words. The women looked at one another. Finally, Greta, tall, sharp-featured, said, "Then ask." Helen smiled faintly. "What's the first thing you'll do when you go home?" Silence. Then someone whispered, "If there's a home left." Helen didn't write at first. She watched, faces drained of certainty, still wearing traces of red lipstick like a fading flag. They weren't enemies now. They were people trying to remember who they used to be. She asked about work, about the camp, about nights when the wind made the walls shake. Slowly, the room loosened. They talked about sewing uniforms for wounded soldiers, about songs from their childhood, about how hard it was to sleep without hearing the hum of engines. When Helen asked about the famous photograph, Greta answered, "They said we looked happy. We weren't. We were just, alive." Helen nodded. "Sometimes that's what happiness is." Anna, who had been silent all morning, leaned forward. "Do your people hate us?" Helen paused. "Some do. Some don't know what to feel anymore." 2 hours passed like minutes. When Helen rose to leave, she hesitated. Greta stood and offered her hand. Their palms met, calloused skin, rough warmth. Nothing was forgiven, but something shifted. That night, Helen sat by the window of her small hotel, her typewriter glowing under a single lamp. The words came easily, heavy and certain. She titled her story, "The Faces of Surrender." In a camp in Kansas, she wrote, 5 women have found what their right never gave them, the right to be human again. The article appeared 2 weeks later in Harper's Weekly. The reaction was immediate. Some called it treasonous sympathy, others called it courage. Veterans wrote letters thanking her for showing the enemy's fragility. Mothers wrote that it made them cry. A few simply said, "Maybe this is peace." At Camp Concordia, the women didn't know their faces were once again in the papers. But they felt something change. Guards smiled more. Someone brought fresh flowers, yellow prairie sunflowers, to the mess hall. Greta placed one in a tin cup. "Maybe they're starting to forgive us," she said. Anna shook her head. "No," she whispered. "They're forgiving themselves." Before Helen left Kansas, she visited the camp one last time. No cameras, no notebook, just a farewell. "Thank you," she told them, "for trusting me." Anna's smile was thin but real. "Did we trust you?" Helen laughed quietly. "Enough to tell the truth." When the jeep rolled away, the women watched through the wire. None waved. But each lifted a hand to her lips, touching that faint red trace the world had turned into a scandal, and a symbol. As the dust rose behind the departing car, Greta murmured, "They'll forget us soon." Anna looked at the horizon. Maybe. But not the question we left them with. What question? Greta asked. Anna turned toward the window, her voice barely a breath. What do you do with forgiveness, once you have it? They gave us mirrors so we could see our faces, but we saw everything we'd done. Autumn settled slowly over Kansas. The fields outside the camp turned gold and brittle, the wind carrying the smell of smoke from distant farms. Rumors spread that the war was over for good, that Germany had surrendered months ago, that the camps would soon empty. Inside the women's compound, silence replaced routine. No more drills, no inspections. Only waiting. The women packed what little they owned, a comb, a book, a handkerchief with initials stitched in blue. The mirrors on the wall, once strange and terrifying, now showed something different, fatigue, yes, but also a quiet kind of defiance. Anna stood before one of them, touching the faint lines around her eyes. Behind her, Greta folded her clothes. "Do you think we'll be different when we go home?" she asked. Greta didn't look up. "I think we already are." Later that afternoon, an American guard entered with a clipboard. "Names," he said. "Tomorrow morning, transport to New York. From there, a ship." The words landed heavy, like the sound of a door unlocking and closing at the same time. The women exchanged looks that carried both relief and fear. Home was a word they hadn't used in years, and no one was sure what it meant anymore. That night, the air grew cold. The wind hummed through the wires, rattling the tin roof. Some women couldn't sleep. Greta sat near the window, watching the moon's reflection in a puddle. It looked like a broken coin. In the darkness, Anna whispered, "Do you remember the lipstick?" Greta laughed softly. "How could I forget? We wore it like armor." Anna reached into her bag and pulled out a small, dented tube, the last one. She set it on the table. "Take it," she said. Greta shook her head. "No. I don't need it anymore." Anna pushed it back toward her. "Freedom isn't something you owe anyone. Keep it, so you don't forget how it felt." In the morning, the women lined up outside the barracks. The guards checked their papers. The American nurse who once brought them soap and scissors came to say goodbye. She hugged each woman briefly, not out of duty, but out of something deeper. When she reached Anna, she paused. "War makes us less human," she said softly. "Maybe this is how we fix it." Anna didn't answer. She only nodded, her eyes clear for the first time in months. By noon, the trucks rolled through the gates. The women sat in the back, the wind tangling their hair. Camp Concordia disappeared behind them, first the barbed wire, then the barracks, then the flagpole standing crooked in the field. On the road, someone began to hum, a tune no one quite recognized. It wasn't a German song or an American one. It was something in between. When they reached the train station, an officer read out instructions. "You'll be processed in New York and repatriated through Bremen. Civilian status. You'll be free." Free. The word sounded too big for their tired mouths. Anna turned to the mirror inside the waiting room, one of those narrow, warped pieces of glass hanging above a washbasin. She stared at her reflection. The same face looked back, but the eyes were older, quieter. The war was gone from them, not erased, but folded into the lines of memory. She wiped the dust from her cheeks and smiled faintly. Not for the camera, not for the guards, for herself. When the train whistle blew, Greta glanced at her friend. "You're not afraid?" Anna looked out the window. "I was. But not anymore. The worst thing already happened." "And what was that?" "Forgetting what it means to be human." The train began to move, wheels grinding against the rails. Outside, Kansas stretched endless and flat under the morning sun. Inside, for the first time in years, no one felt like a prisoner. Back in the empty barracks, the mirrors still hung on the walls. The light from the window touched them, reflecting nothing but dust and air, and perhaps, faintly, the echo of laughter that once dared to exist there. Years later, one of those mirrors would end up in a small museum in Topeka. The placard beneath it would read, "Recovered from Camp Concordia, 1946. Used in the women's compound." Visitors would pass by without knowing that in its glass, for a brief moment, humanity had looked back at itself, and almost recognized the shape of forgiveness. Because the war didn't end with surrender. It ended here, in a quiet room, in front of a mirror, when enemies remembered they were still people. They thought they'd lost everything. But what they found was something the war could never take. Themselves.